So I guess I should thank Sears for sponsoring this session. I hadn't realized that, and now I feel, doubly guilty because, as I forewarned them right now, is I have nothing really particularly new, original to say about risk, and everything that I'm going to do with uncertainty is going to be completely standard in this paper. So this is, it's in the title. I might have rethought that. Yes, this is a paper that's joint with Cheng, Wong. It's not as long in the making as Victor's, but it's taking at least 2 years, in part because Joyce's incentives has changed now that she's at the IMF. So, okay. Okay, I realize that. So, I'm going to be adding to the literature here on female labor force participation and why that's changed over time. I'm going to be very brief on the literature, but I will give you some idea. There's various explanations that have emphasized technological change. You saw one of them today. There's other forms of technological change that could take place. There's other explanations that have emphasized wage changes. Yeah, others that have emphasized changes in the cost of childcare, and then changes in culture. A lot of it has depended about which women one's thinking about, what time period one has been thinking about. What's received relatively less attention has been the relationship between marital instability and female labor force participation. In the data, there's both of these phenomena, at least for the cohorts that I'm going to be interested in, is clearly going on simultaneously. So I'm just going to show you some motivating pictures. Here are 4 cohorts, the married women's labor force participation by age, from the age 25 to the age of 60, starting with the 1935 cohort, all the way through the 1965 cohort. So these are white women, married women, born in these years. And in fact, the cohorts that I'm going to be concentrating on, so just so that you know, is going to be the 1935 cohort and the 1955 cohort. Okay. Here is a different picture that's supposed to give you more motivation. Here's what's happened to divorce. Here, the way we're looking at divorce is measuring a little bit differently. This is because I guess this was a motivational slide. We're looking at it by decade of marriage. So here are the women who married between 1955 and 1964. So you could think of those being the women who were born in the 1935 cohort. They'd be between 20 and 30 years old at that time period. And this is the probability with which they get divorced by these many years of marriage. Okay? And as you saw, between the 1935 cohort, which is getting married more or less around here, and the 1955 cohort, which is basically getting married between the years of 75 to 84, we have a large increase in the probability of divorce. And I'll be much more specific. I'll be much more specific about those numbers right now. I'm not even going to answer a question on these slides. Okay. Victor. I'm not. Aloysius, was it about that slide? Because those are hazards. What exactly is that? It's a probability that you would be divorced. It's a fraction of women who got divorced between, if they were married in that decade, after a certain number of years of marriage. So, okay. So, let me give you some intuition as to why it might be that greater divorce risk would increase married women's labor force participation. Overall, there's a basic asymmetry in the sexes. Here I'm going to agree with Victor, amazingly, which is that women, but this is an institutional factor for me rather than a biological factor, women tend to keep the kids once they get divorced. Okay? And the amount of money that they get from men is not going to be enough to compensate them. For that, for reasons of wages, divorce tends to make women poorer. We can talk about that more later, but divorce is going to make women poorer. That's what the data is going to say. Now, working while married, but you face a greater risk of divorce. If you know you have a higher probability that you're going to get divorced. Working while married is going to increase your labor market experience. which you know you're more likely to use if you're divorced, since you're going to be much more likely to work. And furthermore, if you work while you're married, you're going to have more savings potentially, and those savings then you might be able to translate over to your divorce state. So those are two reasons why intuitively you might think that these two phenomena would go hand in hand. And when we started this project, we were interested in the roles played by these two factors in particular in explaining the rise in female labor force participation in these two cohorts, which saw this dramatic increase in divorce and in female labor force participation.
Are you going to talk at all about changes in how much women get in the event of a divorce, the share of research?
I'm not going to.
Whether that's changed?
Yeah. If you have some facts on that, I'd love to hear them. I'll tell you how we calibrate it.
Raquel, so the presumption is that it's divorce that causes change in...
No, right now there's nothing. I'm just trying to give you some intuition as to why we thought that these phenomena might go hand in hand.
But hand in hand means both ways, right?
But it could be both ways.
Are you going to talk about the other way as well? Or
You'll see.
Okay.
So, when you try to look for evidence on marital instability and married women's labor force participation, and in particular, the causality going this way, there's relatively little evidence that we can look at. There's several regression-based analyses that exploit time differences in the introduction of unilateral divorce laws across US states, that have shown different magnitudes, but basically have concluded that yes, when women face greater divorce risk, they also tended to work more. There's also some evidence for causality that uses proxies for individual variation in divorce risk and female labor force participation. And I'm not going to go into details on this, but I could say that with some notable exceptions, and I'll talk about them more in a second, this issue has largely been ignored by the dynamic quantitative literature, and I think in large part due to the computational burden that having divorce in a model entails. The project this is a part of a larger project, and I'm going to talk very little, in fact probably zero, about work that's ongoing. Part of a larger project with Joyce that wants to investigate the link between marital instability and married women's labor force participation in quantitative dynamic models. There's some key features of the framework which we keep throughout and which we consider important to understanding what we're looking at. One is a life cycle model. We wanted a life cycle model. Why? We want to clearly condition the data by age and by gender, marital status, and that was changing over time. So we really, that was an important feature that we wanted to preserve. A concave utility function. We wanted people to be risk averse. We wanted people to have endogenous consumption, savings, and borrowing. Obviously, we wanted female labor force participation to be endogenous, since that's the main thing that we're trying to look at. And then what we did was to explore two different approaches to marital status. The one I'm going to talk about here is marital transitions as exogenous shocks. I'm going to blame Victor, just because I enjoy doing that. It's as in Kubedu and Rios rule. Okay? So everything that happens to your marriage is going to happen exogenously, so we're not going to be looking at the opposite causality at all. And then we have a project, which I hope to have done by now, but it's not, which has endogenous marital status. And then I'll explain the trade-offs between the two approaches. Okay, there's a reason we do one and then the other. Okay, so let me summarize the exogenous marital status. We're going to be focusing on two cohorts of white men and women, 1935, 1955. Why white? Blacks have a very different trajectory, historical reasons. I won't go into it now. I'm going to calibrate the model to the 1935 cohort, and I'm going to use it to quantify the roles of various things that people have considered important. Not all of them, not technological change, for example, but yes, divorce. Yes, changes in the family structure, the degree of assortativeness, the changes in fertility, the change in the age of marriage. Changes in the wage structure, in particular how the skill premium changed, the gender wage gap changed, the returns to experience might have changed. And then I'm going to actually put all these changes together and look at how much we can explain of the world between 1935 to 1955. The main interest at this point was to then use a model to try to understand the mechanisms through which divorce affects married women's labor force participation. And as I gave you the intuition before, I'm going to try to look at the role of experience. Do women want to get more labor market experience? Is that why they're working more? Is it the desire to increase household savings so that they can transfer some assets to the poor divorce state? Or is it, because, and we're also going to try to understand the role of concavity in this, and I'll explain why the role of concavity. We're going to find that divorce is quantitatively important. We did not know that to begin with. In fact, we were happy to go either way in some sense. It accounts for about 46% of the increase in the labor force participation of married women over their working lives. Wage changes are also quantitatively significant, a bit over half of the increase.
Is that level? Like gender gap?
Sorry?
Is that level of wages, like the or returns to experience?
What do you mean by wage changes?
Fine. So this is a summary, and I'm getting into details, but the wage changes are going to be changes in the skill premium, the gender wage gap, and returns to experience. Okay? And then putting everything together, we're going to account for about 85% of changes in married women's labor force participation, a bit more for college married women, a bit less for high school married women. When we try to understand the divorce mechanism, we're going to show that, or I'll explain to you at least, that experience does not play a significant role, so it's not because women desire more experience. I'm going to show you that actually, in response to divorce risk, savings don't go up. Savings actually fall. So neither of those two reasons that I gave you before is a reason for the increase in married women's labor force participation. And instead, we find that the increase in labor force participation is a result of a compromise between the wife and the husband, given their endogenously conflicting preferences over consumption in different states. And I'm going to be very clear about that, but I'm going to wait 2 minutes. Well, actually more than 2 minutes, 20 minutes.
That's supposed to be everything else being kept constant.
Everything else being in 1935. Everything else.
Risk does not affect asset accumulation. Everything else being constant.
No, divorce risk affects asset accumulation, but in the opposite direction than what we would have expected. That is, if the intuition is what you want to do is you want to have higher assets, more assets, you actually end up with lower assets. So, okay, fine.
I know savings is probably a difficult thing to figure out the data, but are there some facts?
On the asset part, I don't have facts. I mean, I actually, Luana has some facts, and I forget now what they are. We should probably look at them. But it's also, yeah, we should probably look at them. But her facts would be just basically, I think, at a moment in time. For 1935 cohort, we don't have facts on the asset.
The way that things work is that you have divorce, what you have is turnover. And turnover means that if you get married late, somebody will confiscate half your assets. So every time you have changing composition, the possibility that you'll be married means you're going to lose a lot.
It's not the possibility of remarriage actually here. It's just the fact that divorce is a tax on savings, period. But why don't I suggest that we wait 2 more minutes, 20 more minutes, and we'll get into that.
That's weird, Victor, because you gave me a theoretical.
Jeremy, you and Victor are going to continue fights outside. Okay. In terms of the literature, and to understand where we're coming from for this question, say the closest paper to these projects are, there's 2 of them here, particularly the one by Zwiekstein and Aznar. Where is she? Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Just like,
yeah, it's good enough.
Okay. And Aznar Lifshitz. They're also interested in thinking about female labor force participation when it increases over time. They have a dynamic linear life cycle model. Okay. So in particular, there's no attitudes towards risk. There's no savings of borrowing. Female labor forces participation. Like us, they have exogenous shocks to marital status. And they find that marital instability basically plays a negligible role. Okay? So our results are going to be dramatically different from theirs. In theirs, it accounts for about 1% of the increase in female labor force participation between the decades of 1925 to 75, and we're going to be finding close to 50%. So very different results, and we're going to want to explore why. Another paper that's related in the sense that, like our paper, it's going to have endogenous savings consumption decision. It's going to have a concave utility function, is one by Atanasio Lo and Sanchez Marcos. They assume, however, that women are always married, so divorce plays no role in their model, and they're interested in thinking about the role of childcare costs. I'm not sure how much it was appreciated, how elegant the model was that Jeremy presented about 2 talks ago. It's actually an extremely elegant model of the effect of technological change on education, marriage, divorce, and female labor force participation. They, in order to be able to solve their model, they need to do 2 things that we, for our purposes, don't want to do, since we're not interested in finding a sweeping explanation of everything here. They assume that both initial and final years are steady states. We're not going to do that. And there's no endogenously evolving state variables. That is, you choose your education, but then nothing else changes over time. So in particular, there's no savings, and there's no labor market experience, which are 2 of the, at least intuitively, explanations that I wanted to at least examine. There's also 2 other papers in this literature. One is by Matsoko, Claudia Ruiz, and Yamaguchi, who I hope to pin where it's going to be here. I find this paper very ambitious. It's very creative, extremely complicated, computationally extremely demanding, and I'm still not really sure completely what's going on in it, but it's an interesting paper. And then there's the job market paper of Alessandra Buena, who builds on Matsuko's framework, but makes it computationally less demanding by using much longer time periods. So a time period in her model is going to be a year, and that makes it much easier to look at things. Her interest is not really so much on female labor force participation, nor is it about cohorts. It's looking at how savings react to the introduction of unilateral divorce in states with different property rights regimes. Okay, so that's my introduction. The key facts, well, a lot of them you've seen, but some of them are slightly different, so I think it's worth going over them in any case. The key facts are all going to be built using the March CPS. Our 1935 cohort is going to be white men and women born between 34 and 36. Similarly for the 1955 cohort, so it's a 3-year window. Everywhere we're going to be conditioning data on gender, education, age, and marital status. Our education categories are going to be 2. What we're going to call college, which means everyone with at least some college and above, and what we call high school, which means everybody who's either graduated from high school but not gone to any college or below. Here are the main facts that we're after. Okay, so here's a life cycle profile of married women with a high school education for the 1935 cohort. That's this black line here. The red line here, which is basically almost everywhere above, is how much married women with a college, who I'm calling college, were working over the same time, okay, over the same ages. Here, something probably that you're less used to looking at, but is important for our project, is what divorced women are doing. So this is divorced high school women, and this is divorced college women. By the way, when I say what they're doing, what I mean is this is the proportion of women who, between the ages of 25 to 29, who are high school, are working. Okay, that's what these numbers graph. And these are the changes that we see for 1955. Okay, here are the high school, the college, and their divorced counterparts. As you can see, a very large increase. Okay, both for divorce, but less so, especially for high school and college married women. Just to give you one statistic, the labor force participation, just on aggregating over all women, between ages of 30 to 40, which are crucial ages, increased from 40 to 70%. Sorry, there. Yeah.
The working, how do you define working?
Are you in the labor force?
So it can be part-time? You don't distinguish?
I don't. Just are you in the labor force?
So in this line you have the married and the divorced. So if someone is married in 20 to 26 and then divorces, is her dot, her contribution to the dot is in the
Right.
first line?
Right, yeah, so we're not following an individual over time and then averaging over all individuals that we're following over time, because then we would have that person's getting married, divorced, remarried, but rather we're looking at a category, keeping that category fixed, and then aggregating over that category.
And the divorce includes those who are married?
No, sorry. Divorced means divorced, and married, you could be remarried or not remarried. And singles are not here at all. And I'll tell you why in a second. There's no, I did not plot single women. Okay. This is a period that saw a lot of changes. A lot of these changes are endogenous, and that's what Jeremy's mostly interested in talking about, and a lot of others. Just pointing out Germany, those are the papers I know best. And Nezi and Cesar. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to summarize the big changes over this time period. And when I'm doing that, I'm going to try to give you also an idea of how we calibrate it, because I'm not going to have time to do both things separately. Okay. So one thing that happened during this time period is that the education gender gap closed. This actually doesn't play any role because everything's conditional on education in our model. This is something you might as well know. Originally, our paper tried to explain this. We thought women want to work more because there's more divorce risk. They're also going to want more education. And we really did not have a sophisticated enough education model, and we just gave up on it. We weren't able to explain very much, by the way. Okay, so about a 10 percentage point gap in education between men and women. By the 1955 cohort comes around, that gap basically goes to 0. Now, I showed you that the probability of marriage ending in divorce before 20 years basically doubled. It went from 20 to 40%. That's not what we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at much tighter statistics. So let me just show you, again, some summary statistics, and I'll even show you some even less summary statistics, okay? So in the 1935 cohort, the numbers here are what's the probability that your marriage ends in a divorce before 20 years, okay? And as you can see, there's not that much differences between college and high school categories at this stage, except for men. Okay, that's where you tend to see a difference. So, between, it's not 0, it's not equal, it's still there, but it's not gigantic yet, okay? So 16% relative to 20% for high school women versus college women in 1935. By the time the 1955 cohort comes around, so now we're not conditioning on your marriage, just conditioning on whether you got married, okay? And then the probability of divorce before 20 years, it basically doubles. It's 38% relative to 36%. We see the same thing happening to men. High school men, much more likely to get divorced than college men. This difference between the behavior of high school men and college men is what really increases between these two cohorts. It goes from 40 relative to 31%. Interesting to me, at least when I've done this project, is if you had asked me what the probability a person gets remarried, I would have told you it's 30%. Okay? Very far out of the ballpark. Basically, everybody remarries with more or less the same probability of 86%, 85%. That really doesn't change over the two cohorts. Okay, so again, this is the probability that you will remarry within 20 years of getting divorced. Okay? And again, the exception is college-educated men who are slightly more likely to get married.
So
remarried, sorry.
You're trying to decide as a woman whether to complete college education. This is obviously going to increase your incentive to do that. But on the other hand, you're probably going to be less likely to get married. In fact, in the data, much less likely to get married. So that would, I guess, in a sense, reduce that.
Right. I'm not going to be explaining education.
Okay.
So education is going to be an endowment. Here, you're going to start life at the age of 25 when we get to the calibration, and you're going to either have a high school or a college education. Okay.
What's extraordinary about the state is how stable
It is.
things are between men and women rather than anything else.
What do you mean by stable between men? The remarriage rate is very stable.
Macro effect and on the divorce rate, and that's it. What men do vis-a-vis what women hasn't changed that much.
Right. Don't forget, I'm not forcing.
Vis-a-vis high school hasn't changed that much.
Right. So what I can do, which other people don't necessarily always do, is that I don't have to condition. I don't have to pretend you're marrying somebody in your cohort. These are white men with a high school education, born between 1934 and 1936. They did not necessarily marry these women. They married the women that they married. And these are their divorce probabilities. So there's no adding up constraint that's necessary. Even then, they would be marrying with different proportions. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, Kostas?
Just an observation.
Okay.
I'm surprised at this statement.
Yep. No, that's an interesting. So I'm going to give you, this is what we're actually going to calibrate to.
Just one thing.
Yeah.
For must be the time to remarriage that matters, right? If it's 3 years or 10 years, or because that's a measure for risk, or a measure or something.
Yeah, we don't have finer data on that. So, sorry, we'll see that in a second. So here is the per period divorce and remarriage probabilities. I won't go into the details of how we calculate it. This comes from the SIP data. So this is what we're actually going to be feeding into the model when we look at your exogenous risk of being divorced. This is in period 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're going to be 5-year periods, so it's going to be the first, basically from the age of 25 to the age of 45. These are the divorce risks that you face. High school versus college, men versus women, 1935 versus 1955. So this is a disaggregated view of what I showed you previously. The one place where we do fudge things, which has to do with what Jeremy, which has to do with what Jeremy just asked me, is in the remarriage probability, where there just wasn't enough data points. And so what we did, and you can criticize it for sure, is that we smoothed the aggregate probability of 85% uniformly over those 4 periods. And that's what these probabilities in red are. But you could argue that they might be different, and so they may. Yeah.
I'm really quite puzzled between 35 and 55. I mean, in 55, your divorce hazard has negative duration dependence, which makes sense. But in the 35 cohort, they look like almost constant or increasing.
Well, don't forget, one of the things that's going on right around here is a change in divorce laws in the United States. So you go, it depends on what state you're living on, so the timing is different, but basically that's why you see this relatively high here. Here, in fact, you see the opposite. It's the divorce risk is higher at the beginning, and then it lowers. And I think that explains the behavior that you see there. So there's part of a divorce change that's happening that is indeed, in some sense, exogenous, which is that it's much easier to get divorced. Let me continue with the changes. Marriages became slightly more assortative. Here I would agree with Victor. We don't find any big changes in assortativeness. I think it's very sensitive to what categories you take. If you look at years of education, both men and women's degree of assortativeness, you can measure them separately because, as I said, they're marrying different people, different cohorts. You can look at them separately. They increase, but they just a bit. Nonetheless, it's something that received a lot of attention in the literature, so we're definitely going to put it in. I think it's much more interesting not just to look at the assortativeness, which has to do with the existing distribution, but rather to look at who you're actually marrying and how that's changed, because that's very important. Even if assortative hasn't changed, who you marry has changed. So in particular, if you look at the 1935 cohort, if you're a college woman, the probability that your husband has a college degree is 75%. What about for the 1955 cohort? It barely changes. It moves up to 78%. Okay? Not a big change. High school women, on the other hand, are much more likely to be married to a college man than before. There's much more college men around. Okay? It goes from 21 to 29%. Okay, this is, again, conditional upon being married. College men are much more likely to be married to a college woman, both in their high school counterparts and across time. Why? There's a lot more college women around. And high school men's probability of marrying a college woman also doubles. Okay, so large changes with very small changes in assortativeness. The other big change that occurred for these cohorts was a really large change in fertility. Okay? Fertility fell on average from 3 kids per woman to 1.9 kids. We're going to be interested, again, everything is going to be conditioned on who you are. So in the 1935 cohort, a college woman was having 2.5 kids, and a high school woman was having 3.2 kids. High school women basically lose an entire kid between the 1935 cohort and the 1955 cohort. College women lose about 3/4 of a kid. Okay, large changes.
Question about the assortativeness. Why is it? Is it just a different way of measuring it that you and Victor are finding something different from?
Oh, well, where you find something different? I don't know exactly how they measure it. If you do years of education, your numbers are going to be about 0.63 and 0.61. One is for women, one's for men. If you You can do a 0-1. You can do a rank correlation. They did a 0-1. That's going to give you, and then it depends who your zeros are and who your ones. So having finished college, for example, is probably much more assortative. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. You know, so it just depends on the cut you take on the data. Right. So it's not that we're disputing.
We're talking about different data. We're just talking about different ways of looking at the same data.
Well, it depends on how you cut the data. If you cut the data by certain categories, and then we might want to argue about which categories were important for 1935 versus which categories were important for
college versus high school?
Right. And then you give right, but college is going to be completed college for them. Okay? Then you're going to get one number, and they're doing 0-1 merit.
As one category, there is lots of assortative. There is an increase. If you
right.
look at more of a smooth measure,
there's some college and above or something.
Yeah. So if you look at years of education, that increased, but just a bit. And then, as I said, we're not going to take a stance on that, you know, in the sense that we're just going to force it to respect the data. Okay. The other thing that changed, and I'm sorry I didn't put up a graph of it, is the initial proportions in each marital status. Now I'm speaking a little bit softly. The initial proportions are going to be when people start the life at age 25. A lot of people are married by age 25. So some people are going to be married, some people are going to be single, and some people are going to be divorced. We're going to start them off with the proportions that we see in the data, and that's changed also between these two cohorts.
They come with some kids.
They do. They do come with kids. And again, we force that to respect the data. Okay. So that's fertility. Then changes in the wage structure. So changes in the wage structure is that the skill premium increased for both men and women by 12 percentage points. Okay, so it's different skill premium, but they increase by the same amount. The ratio of female to male wages, so these are averages, average female to average male wages, increased from 61 cents to 72 cents on the dollar. And the returns to experience for women, at least according to some of the evidence that's out there, increased from 2% to 3%. Okay, so that's what, there's some, you know, you can dispute 3 or 5%. We went for the number 3%, and then we do robustness. And then, you know, following Atanasia's finding, we're also going to allow child care costs to fall. And when we come to the calibration, we're going to look at a 20% fall in child care. These are slightly different time periods than he's looking at, slightly longer. He argues for a 15% fall in child care costs. We'll put in a 20% fall in child care costs. Those are the facts. Those are the big things. Can somebody tell me how much time I have?
15 minutes.
50, 50.
No, that was.
So, you know, it's the accent. I don't get it. Okay. All right. So now I really have to zoom. So I'm going to try not to take too much time over details, but I have to give you enough of the model. So the life cycle model, you're born, you're either female or male, you're endowed with a given education level. And in period 0, all agents draw an initial marital status outcome, the single S, married M, divorced D. They also draw a permanent spousal type. And I always forget this letter's name. Someone's going to help me. Zeta. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, Zeta. So let me tell you why we have a permanent spousal type, okay? You saw that when Jeremy was talking or when Victor was talking, they said, well, you know, one of the reasons they want to look at being in a steady state is because at least they have a fixed point to solve for that, okay? Fixed point over, you know, what possible marriages you can enter into, et cetera. Here, we don't have a fixed point. You know, this is not, we're looking at a life cycle. So we would face, even if we don't have, it's not hard to endogenize marriage. It's very easy to endogenize marriage. What's hard is to then solve computationally for all the complications that ensue. So we would actually face almost the same burden, computational burden, if we didn't take a shortcut. And our shortcut is to endow people with a certain type. So, for example, Shetel, who raised his hand, he could be my type. What does that mean that I'm endowed with Shetel as my type? It means that I know, after entering that initial marriage market, the characteristics of my actual or potential future spouse. And anytime I marry, remarry, divorce, should I remarry? I'm going to marry someone with those same characteristics. One second. What characteristics am I talking about? I'm talking about their fixed characteristics. So in the case of Shetel, it would be his education. It would also be characteristics that are moving over time. And what I'm going to assume is that I know those characteristics up to that point in time. So in particular, when I'm trying to calculate, how many assets my future spouse might have, it's shuttles, future assets. We haven't talked about wages. They're going to have a persistent and a transitory component. It's going to be shuttle's persistent component up to that point in time. We haven't talked about kids. It's going to be my kids up to that point in time, or our kids up to that point in time, if he has kids. So that's what I mean by being endowed with a spousal type. It doesn't get rid, where is Glenn? It doesn't get rid of all uncertainty, but it does decrease it. So
that's not an equilibrium object.
no, it's not an equilibrium object. No.
Well, it's not that. What you have is not an equilibrium.
No, it's not an equilibrium object.
No. The location is not an equilibrium allocation.
Very different state.
Very different state.
What are you saying then?
That if you look at changes, that's this zeta would also change.
Oh yeah, it will change.
So the mapping from the imputation of how you change that, you pull it from the air.
No, okay. No. So these are going to be, the zetas are going to be the zetas from the actual men who look that way. So in particular, so you're going to be endowed with a certain type, and then we look at how that man's type evolves over time, how his wages evolve over time, how his assets are bound to evolve over time, and then you're going to be matched with such a type. Okay? But it's yeah. Okay. In that sense, it is an equilibrium object. It's not an equilibrium object in the sense that we're making sure that he's available at that time period, et cetera, to marry you. Yeah.
So the beauty of a finite life cycle model is that in many cases you don't have to solve for like a fixed point thing. Imagine just think of
I'm going to ask you to be quick. Yes.
Imagine everyone starts at age 25. No one is married. Then all you have to do, and then the life is over by say age 45.
Yeah.
Then all you have to do, in some sense, is you have to guess somehow a sequence of distributions from 25 to 45.
You'll look at our computational burden, and then you can tell me whether you think it'd be easy to do that. We concluded that it wasn't. It's not that we didn't understand that. We concluded it wasn't. Okay. Preferences. Everybody shares the same preferences over consumption. Consumption, actually, when you're married, is a public good. They do not share preferences over the disutility of working. Women and single women and all men are normalized in terms of having a disutility of working of 0. Given that normalization, we will not look at a single moment for we will not try to match a single moment for how much single women and how much men work. Okay? The disutility of working is allowed to depend on your education if you're a woman. It's allowed to depend on your marital status. Are you single, married, or divorced? And it's allowed to depend on KT. KT is a vector that's telling you the number and ages of your kid.
How you
Okay.
You don't match employment?
I do. I will match employment. I'm not at the calibration yet.
Because you said you're not going to use any of these models.
If I did say that, I misspoke. I'm not going to use a single moment. So this is married or divorced women, and I will be matching the labor force participation rates over the life cycle of married and divorced women. Yeah. Okay. Households are allowed to save through risk-free bonds with exogenously set interest rates. They can also borrow, subject to a no default in any state of nature constraint. Okay, natural borrowing constraint. Life has 2 stages, a working period and a retirement period. Very briefly, retirement is very boring. You don't face any more risk in terms of getting married or divorced or anything as of that point. As of age 60, you die at age 85. You spend periods T1 through 7 in working life, which you begin at age 25, and that's where all the action takes place. There are wage draws during your working life, which are going to make you decide, which you're going to look at before deciding whether to work or not. Again, men always work. Single women always work. The ones who are making the decisions, and I'll show you how they make the decisions in a few minutes, is going to be the married and divorced women, and they're going to be drawing wages. The wages are allowed to depend on just what year it is. There's a returns to experience. There's a cost to your human capital if you did not participate in the labor market in the previous period. And there's a stochastic component. The stochastic component has a usual persistent and transitory component.
Genuine experience or age?
For women, it's genuine experience. For men, it's age. So
genuine experience and a penalty.
And a penalty. This is a penalty from not having participated last period.
Depreciation as well as
Exactly. And it's to stop women from going like this into the in and out of the labor market. Okay. Okay, just let me give you a little snapshot of the way the model works. So it's that time, think of it as time equals 0, where your marital type is revealed, you're endowed with education, you enter that marriage market, that initial marriage market. You come out, life starts, age 25. You get a fertility shock. Everyone can get fertility shocks. You get a wage draw, make decisions about work, consumptions, and saving. And at the end of the period, having made these decisions, having worked, etc., you get a marital shock. A marital shock can transit you from being married to being divorced, from being divorced to being remarried, and from being single to being married. Okay? And then you enter period 2. And that continues during your working life, and then you enter retirement. What matters about divorce? Here we probably could do this better. When you get divorced, you can remain divorced at least 1 period. 1 period, again, is 5 years, so that's lengthy. Okay? So if we were doing this again, we would redo that. Okay? We just have some people instantaneously remarry. The median amount, if you look in the data, the median amount of time people remain divorced is about 5 years. So it's not off the median, but it's not going to capture that variation very well. Children reside with the mother upon divorce. That's the major gender asymmetry that we're introducing, aside from anything that's inherent in wages or returns to experience. When you get divorced, you split the marital assets. A fraction alpha, it's going to be a half, goes for the wife. The remaining half goes to the husband. And the man is going to pay the woman child support as long as his wife, ex-wife, is not remarried, and they have a child that's lower than the age of 20. Children remain with their parents, either mother or the 2 parents, until the age of 20 in the model. And upon retirement, the ex-wife receives a portion of the husband's retirement income if she is not remarried. Okay. So that's what divorce does. Retirement, I'm going to flash through. Let me show you one.
I'm sorry, Raquel.
I have 10 minutes.
Divorce rules. So if you get divorced, you get your husband's Social Security benefits in your model?
Yeah, you do. You get You get a fraction of your husband's benefits, exactly, unless you're remarried. Okay. Divorce. No, sorry, wrong way. Let me give you one maximization problem, okay? And just to show you how the model works, and then we'll move on. Okay, so this is a budget constraint of a married couple. I just heard married, they're the most interesting people here. This is their expenditures. The C hat means it's expenditure rather than consumption. This is your expenditures. This is your asset decision, your savings decision, and that has to be equal to your sources of income. This is your earnings on your assets from last period. This is the wife's earnings from working, if she worked, so PT was equal to 1. These are the child care costs, kappa, which could depend on the age structure of the kids. We're going to distinguish between young and old kids. And this is the husband's income. He works for sure. Okay? What's the relationship between consumption and expenditure consumption? It's simply deflated via an equivalent scale, which depends on how many grown-ups there are, so that's the S, the marital status, and it depends on the age structure of the kids in a very detailed way. Okay. What's the law of motion for assets? Well, if you stay married, your asset plan, really I should have said that what you do here is when you decide how much to save, it's really a plan. And then because you're faced with a marital shock, your asset plan may not actually be your actual assets. Instead, if you remain asset, your asset plan is indeed your actual assets. If you divorce, however, you get that fraction alpha if you're a woman, 1 minus alpha if you're a man. There's a complicated state variable here. There's we didn't think of using stars. So here's your education, the assets, the experience up to last period, whether or not you worked last period if you're a woman, the age structure and number of your kids, the persistent part of your wages, and the characteristics of your spouses. And the characteristics of your spouses, of your potential spouse, or your actual spouse has, of course, all these things inside it. So it's a very large state vector. this is a maximization problem faced by a married household. We are going to assume a collective household and that they maximize a weighted, they maximize the weighted utility of the woman, of the wife, and of the husband. Chi is the weight that we're putting on the wife. 1 minus chi is on the man. As you can see, therefore, this is simply the instantaneous utility. It's the utility from consumption, same for the man, public good. This is a disutility born entirely by the woman. So again, different from their paper. It's born entirely by the woman from working. Okay? So that's just the instantaneous part. That's today. Then there's all the future. That's going to get, with probability 1 minus d, think of it that way, you're not going to get divorced, and you're going to face the same maximization problem tomorrow. With probability d, you will get divorced. Consequently, the value of being a woman who's divorced in time t plus 1, given the transitions of the state variable, continues to get the weight chi. The value of this gets, for the man, gets the weight 1 minus chi. From this is going to come out a certain, let's call it a C star, a P star, and an A star. That is an asset plan, participation decision, and a consumption decision. And then if you want to figure out what the value function is for a married woman or a married man, you need to plug those into their particular utility functions.
You shouldn't write it like that. It's not BPM. It's not such a thing as the value of the household. The value, that's a problem.
This is, you have your notation. This is not a value. You didn't hear me. This is a maximization problem. I never said value.
What's the right side?
This?
No, there's a VT, but it doesn't matter. The VT plus 1. So it is the value.
No. Knowing that they're going to face this maximization problem tomorrow. No. I don't think, well, argue about whether you want to argue theory with me. But, all right. Calibration. OK. Parameters, there's a whole slew of parameters. I won't go into it very much. I have no time. You're going to kill me, but I'm going to say a lot of these things are standard. Some of them are standard. Some of them, you really have no idea. Pareto weight for the wife. We put 0.3. Valena has 0.3. John Knowles, I think in a paper, has something around there. You don't remember probably, but we looked it up. We experiment. We do robustness for this. Blah, blah, blah. McClellan scale, fertility shocks. Child support is we use 10% of husband's income. That's how you support your child until the ages of 20. And we're going to so those are things that are set exogenously. Then the parameters that are set internally are 27. Okay. Those are the disutility from labor by marital status, education, and children, childcare costs, wage depreciation, and time-varying wage intercepts for women. From the men, we can get it from the data. For the women, we have to get it because of the endogeneity of women's decisions. We're going to be matching 43 moments. That's all the labor force participations that I showed you by age, by marital status, and by education in each period. The gender wage gaps by period, and the skill premia, this should say, for women by period. For the men, we can just get it directly from the data. I'm not going to talk to you about that. This is how well our model does. Our model does really excellently, so I'm not going to show you more than this. The black spots are the data. The colored spots is our model. This is 1935. We really want it to do well, because if it doesn't do well, we can't ask what changed for 1955. Okay. To give you an idea of how costly it is to get divorced, it is costly for women to get divorced. There's various ways of measuring it. I'm not going to go into it very much, but basically, women suffer falls in their average consumption levels if they're divorced just for one period, say in the second period of life, about 19% for college women, 10% for high school women. Men, on the other hand, gain from being divorced. I'm not talking about psychic. I'm talking about the utility from consumption. About the psychic, we have nothing to say because it's not endogenous, so we don't need it. Okay. So we do various things. Can you tell me how many minutes I have?
2 minutes.
Okay. We do various things which I won't take you through. We look at what the effect of assortativeness is. It actually makes women work less. We look at the effect of divorce. That's the red line by itself with assortativeness. We then maintain assortativeness throughout, not because we think it's so important, but because it's changing the proportions of people and who people are married to in the population. And that really raises, because the risk is concentrated here, it really raises the propensity of women to work in the first few periods of married life. We then look at childcare, which adds a bit, not anywhere near as much as in Orazio's paper, but it does increase female labor force participation. We then look at wages by themselves, the skill premium, returns to experience. We find that those play large roles. And then we put everything together, and everything together is a blue line. So that's as much as our model is able to explain for high school versus married high school versus married college women. You can see we do pretty well. We're missing quite a bit down here. We're missing something over here. Okay. In terms of the divorced people, which I haven't been showing you as I've gone along, we are over-predicting, okay? When we put everything together, we have divorced women actually working more than what they should be working according to the data.
Okay, the identification here comes from the laws. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I will, but I'm actually going to spend 2 minutes, and then you can ask me, and then maybe I'll get another 2 minutes. I'm going to spend 2 minutes just explaining why divorce matters in the way that it matters. So let me just skip the summary of this, and I just want to try to make you understand why divorce matters in this model. So the first thing we investigate, I'm going to spend 2 minutes on this. First thing we investigate is experience. How can we get rid of experience in this model? Well, what we do is we just give women a return to age, just like sort of men have, exogenous. We say, suppose you face you would get the same wages whether or not you worked as though if you had experience. And we ask, by how much would your labor supply increase over your life? Basically, for college women, it's about 0.5%. For high school women, it's even less. So basically, really unimportant. This cannot be the motive, is what our model is saying. What about household assets? Is it because you want to increase your savings so that you're a woman, your consumption is going to drop violently? Is it because you want to bring more assets? Well, this is what happens to the assets of women. This is in the original. This is a married household with a high school woman. This is what's happening to her assets. They go from -4 in the original model with the 1935 divorce risk to -5 at that age, and so on. So in the 4 periods in which she's facing divorce risk, assets actually fall. They borrow even more. Okay, the same thing is true for college women. So the conclusion is that from this part is that marital assets are actually going to fall in all periods in which divorce risk exists. What does this mean? It necessarily means that married household consumption is increasing. Why is it increasing? It's increasing because married women are more likely to work. They're bringing more income into the family. And also savings is falling. They're actually borrowing more. So in response to the divorce risk, what families have decided to do is to actually increase their consumption. Why is this? So there's several reasons. I'm going to emphasize this one. I'm going to give you the difference in what men and women want. Men want to increase their marital consumption. Why do they? Because they're actually going to be better off when they get divorced. Again, just in terms of consumption. They're going to be better off. To smooth consumption, they would actually like to eat more while they're married. So consumption smoothing means that men want more consumption today. Furthermore, divorce is a tax on savings. Every dollar that you save, 50% of it goes to a wife. So there's more probability that you're going to divorce, less of a reason to save. What do women want to do? Women want to decrease marital consumption. Okay, why? They want to smooth consumption over the 2 states. The consumption smoothing for women is actually going to dominate the tax effect on savings. There's both effects that go in different directions. It's still a tax on savings, but they're going to want to, their desire to smooth consumption is dominating. Therefore, what is happening is, why the reason that women are increasing their labor force participation in response to divorce risk is actually because this is the optimal compromise within the household to the increase. Give him my parade away. No, yeah. Let me finish. Let me explain it. Give him my parade away. It's the optimal, it's the compromise. If it didn't work, what would happen? Savings would even fall even more.
So
okay.
It's the opposite from Alessandra's data, right? So savings are actually went up.
Yeah, I don't really remember. But I want to show you how this depends on bargaining power. Okay? So let me show you 2 seconds for bargaining power, and I'm done, I promise. Okay, so one question, like Nezzy said, well, that's for your bargaining power. So we had said the woman gets 0.3. So what would if the woman had 0.5 or 0.7? What would happen? What we find is that as a woman's bargaining power increases, actually savings does increase, both for high school and college women. But in all cases, labor force participation also increases because it's always part of the optimal package. Part of it is make the man happier by working more, no matter how little is his bargaining power. Here his bargaining power is 0.3. Okay, make the man happier by working more, and in response, increase your savings. So that's what we find. Okay, I've gone over my time, and I'm happy to take more questions. Am I done? Okay, I'm not going to go further. Thank you.